everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. At today's press conference, we're going to highlight two initiatives that relate to traffic stops that are not immediately related to safety threats and consent searches. As the mayor and police commissioner, I'm committed to making the kinds of improvements to the police bureau that provide greater fairness and ensure equitable policing, not just based on intent, but actual outcomes. I also value a police bureau that's responsive to the needs of the community. I want it to be accountable and transparent to the community that it serves, and I want it to be able to evolve with the changing needs and dynamics of the community. At the same time, I'm hearing from members of the community that everyone wants to feel safe. And for some people in this community, that means that they want to ensure that we have adequate staffing of our police bureau, and at the same and that they have the tools, the resources, and the training that they need in order to be successful. And at the same time, I'm also hearing from people who want to ensure that we have a bureau that can continue to improve its crime prevention and its public safety, as well as gaining the trust of all Portlanders. There are some in the community who believe that having adequate police personnel who are trained and who have the resources they need stands in opposition to meaningful improvement of public safety. On the other hand, there are those in the community who see increased accountability, transparency, and other efforts to reduce racial disparities in policing as an impediment to public safety. I want to be clear that I do not see having adequate policing resources aligned with proper tools and training to be in conflict with building community trust through enhanced accountability, transparency, and the elimination of racial disparities. They are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they are mutually inclusive. We can both have a capable public safety response as well as rise to the calls for improved policing in our community. And that can be seen in the improvements that we've already implemented. That's why I've resisted further budget cuts to the police bureau. I want to ensure that we have the adequate staffing we need. And that's why I've supported meaningful improvements, including those that have been brought to us by members of the community. That's why my recent budget triples the size of the Unarmed Public Safety Officer Program, which I launched 2 years ago. I elevated the Portland Police Bureau's Equity Inclusion Team to Chief Lovell's office so that they now report directly to him. I've instituted greater transparency and full council involvement in current negotiations for a new Portland Police Association contract. I've retained the OIR group to look at ways to improve the police bureau, and their analysis will help us inform the next steps that we take together. Under my direction, Chief Lovell put together the Enhanced Community Safety Team to address gun violence in our city. And we're in the process of forming our focused intervention team that will operate under and receive guidance from a community oversight group. Today, we're announcing two more improvement initiatives regarding the new actions we're about to share with you. A legislative measure that was in Salem, House Bill 2002 in the legislature, which was championed by leading Black lawmakers and advocates for criminal justice change, would have made significant changes to policing statewide. Unfortunately, that bill has stalled in the legislature. But we're not going to wait for another legislative session to bring about the outcomes that we want to see. That's why we're happy to have you here today so we can explain the two newest actions we're taking as we continue evolving the methods and the mission of the Portland Police Bureau. Despite the resistance that comes naturally as we seek to implement change, we're determined to do whatever it takes to meet the demands of the community, ensuring that everyone feels safe and that they're being treated fairly. One of the many things that I'm working to change is the historic fact, proven by data, that Black people in our community have been disproportionately more likely to be stopped by police than their non-Black counterparts. This was also recently highlighted during a Black male town hall co-hosted by myself and Commissioner Hardesty. I want to thank the participants of that town hall for their recommendations. I also want to thank the men and women in the Police Bureau who provided important input on this subject. It's part of a clear pattern in recent years that has certainly been highlighted by the racial justice movement we're experiencing now, and it's a pattern that will continue unless we do something about it. Also, according to the Bureau of Transportation, we've seen an increase in traffic fatalities this year, up 53% over the same time last year. That's why I've been working closely with Chief Lovell to implement two significant changes with the Bureau: traffic stops that are not immediately related to safety threats, and consent searches. Excuse me. Chief Lovell will share more about the specifics with you on these changes in a moment. The goal of these two changes is to make our city both safer and more equitable, helping reduce the number of Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are disproportionately impacted by consent searches and traffic stops. To lend a little perspective of what I'm talking about, I refer to data from 2019 that was released by the Police Bureau just last fall. It shows that white Portlanders, who make up 75% of the population, accounted for 65% of the traffic stops done by Bureau officers. Meantime, Black Portlanders, though only about 6% of the population, made up a staggering 18% of the stops. Given that trend, excuse me for a moment, officers will soon be working under new directions to focus their enforcement on moving violations that represent an immediate danger to public safety. That includes speeding and careless and/or reckless driving, to name just a few. This will also enable the Police Bureau to focus its traffic enforcement efforts on safety-related issues, which must be our priority now. Also, police officers will continue to use probable cause to stop dangerous drivers or to make stops pursuant to information related to specific investigations. Prioritizing immediate safety threats will allow our officers to focus on what's truly important: keeping Portlanders safe. This is also aligned with the Portland Bureau of Transportation's Vision Zero goals to significantly reduce traffic fatalities in our city. When the Oakland, California Police Department enacted similar practices beginning in 2017, it cut the number of traffic stops by more than half. The decrease was even larger in the percentage of Black drivers being stopped over the same time period. Now, regarding consent searches, Police Bureau data over the last 5 years shows that Black drivers are searched at nearly double the rate of other drivers. We're also learning that there are many cases where a person is unaware of their rights when they've been asked by officers for consent to conduct a search. We're working to change this and to ensure that everyone is informed about their rights before a consent search. Under our new consent search procedure, which is part of my 19-point police reform plan, officers must clearly inform the person of their right to refuse or revoke their consent. They'll also record their request when they ask for consent to search. Again, I'll let Chief Lovell talk more about the procedures around this change specifically. Both operational changes will be regularly tracked to generate feedback regarding their effectiveness. Incremental reviews will be done to ensure the desired outcomes are in fact being met. If they're not, we'll revisit and rework the procedures until we get them right. I know we have a lot more work to do, but these changes constitute significant progress in our work to reimagine our public safety system for the better and to continue operationalizing our city core values of anti-racism, communication, collaboration, equity, transparency, and fiscal responsibility. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chief Chuck Lovell. Good afternoon, Chief.
Thank you, Mayor. Thanks everyone for being here. We're an organization that's made substantial changes, especially over the last decade. And these are two more to add to that. As many of you know, we have limited resources and we're trying to direct those resources most appropriately. As far as traffic's concerned, so far this year, we've had 28 people die in traffic fatalities and crashes. And that number is up considerably from this time in 2020, over 100%. We had to make a tough decision to reassign traffic officers back to the precincts to help with call load. But however, even with that change, traffic still is the responsibility of every officer. But given the resources that we have and the limited time officers have to do this type of enforcement, I'm directing our sworn personnel to focus on safety violations and enforcement in high crash corridors. We need to focus on behaviors that result in serious or fatal crashes, such as speeding, DUI, distracted driving, failure to obey traffic control devices, and things of that nature. Stops of non-moving violations or lower level infractions are still allowed, but with an emphasis on safety and have an actionable investigative factor to them. This is not a new directive, and I expect officers to still operate within the directives. However, we've been listening to community, watching legislative efforts, and really managing our resources as best as possible. And this seems like a sensible time to make this shift. As far as our consent searches go, we have a current directive that we're revising around consent searches. What this will do is solidify our approach and our directive and procedures around those searches, increase the documentation by recording these stops and handing out cards that inform people of their rights during a request for a consent search. We're hopeful that we will get this data and then we'll have the opportunity to review it frequently and make adjustments where necessary. The real goal here is safety, but we're hopeful that it'll have some impact on disparities. Being able to look at the data over the next several months and quarters will give us some very valuable input on where we need to go and adjust from here. That's all I have really on these two changes. I'd like to open it up for questions at this point.
All right, members of the media, if you can raise your hand, I will call on you when I see the hands raised. Let's begin with Maxine Bernstein from the Oregonian. Maxine, who's your question for?
Thank you. This is for the chief. You mentioned recording the request for a consent search. How is this audio recording or video recording? And if you can talk a little bit about what the process was to get to this spot.
Yeah, we're talking about audio recording. We don't have, body cameras, as you know. So we would have essentially like a phone app where we could do an audio recording. And what this does is it helps if these cases come to court, it demonstrates that the involved person did in fact consent, and it makes sure that the follow-up piece is a little more solidified. This is something that we've been talking about for a while, and I think some other jurisdictions have gone to it. A lot of places do this with body cameras, but we're not in that position. So this is kind of where we landed as far as our approach to consent searches.
Okay, thank you for that, Chief. Kelly Azar, K2 News.
Hi there, thank you so much for taking the time today. My question can go honestly to Chief Lovell or Mayor Wheeler as well. This is about the RRT and their resignation, but they brought up specifically in their response to resigning from that team that they didn't feel basically that they were checked in on enough or what they were dealing with was taken seriously. So I guess my question is, how regularly did you meet with the team to discuss any concerns about their guidance and what they were up against nightly? And then Chief Lovell, if you'll expand, you're mentioning we don't have body cameras. Are we to the point where Portland needs to step up and get them? Do you wish the city would do that?
I'll start the answer to both those parts. I checked in with our RRT folks fairly regularly. I would go out to the IMT, incident management team, but I'd also go visit them where they were staging prior to them deploying for nightly events. The mayor and I met with them together after the bulk of the summer crowd control events had ended. We did a wellness piece that allowed them 70 hours of wellness, where we both came in and talked to them and let them express some of their concerns from the summer. And, just internally here, I would see a lot of the members of RRT on a regular basis and talk with them. And then, but I think it's important to remember too, we're talking about people, individuals who had a really traumatic summer in some cases. And I think that it's important to, when we think about RT, realize that they worked very hard and did a lot of great work this summer, work that I'm proud of. And I think to me, it's important to recognize just the human factor behind the people that do that work. And I personally think body cameras would be beneficial. I'm a fan of body cameras. I think most officers here would say that they would welcome body cameras.
And if I could jump in on that as well. So I've also met with the RRT previously. I met with the entire unit some number of months ago. They expressed some concerns at that time. I also met with RRT leadership as well as Bureau leadership after the resignation. And when I met with the RRT members themselves, here's what I heard. I heard them say that for 14 months, they have been out there doing the best they can under very challenging circumstances. They didn't use the word, but I heard them say that they were under a great deal of stress. They were concerned that they weren't getting the kind of support that they would like to see either from elected leaders or the community at large. And the decision to indict one of their members was not the cause of their resignation, but it was maybe the final straw for them. And we had a good conversation. We had a productive conversation. I committed to continuing to work with them to address the specific concerns that they raised. And as you know, they've sent me a note, and they've sent I believe my colleagues on the city council the same note. I'm committed to working through those issues with them. But I also want to be clear, in the near term, we are not going to leave a gap around protecting the public. And so I immediately worked with the chief. We directed that the mobile field force units be deployed. We heard clearly from the RRT members, they're not resigning from the police bureau, they're still trained. They indicated they would still step up if asked to protect the community. And we will, of course, ask them to do that if necessary. And we've also developed stronger ties with the state police, their MRT teams. And under extremely unusual circumstances, I would still have the ability to ask the governor for support from the National Guard if necessary. But I want to be clear, none of those things, we haven't had any incident that rises to that level. We will continue to support the community, and we'll continue to respect the men and women of the Portland Police Bureau who do the tough work in the Bureau every day. And then with regard to body cams, I support them. But again, this is not a decision I can make unilaterally on behalf of the council. I'll continue to do my best to make that case. We will continue to seek sources of funding for body-worn cameras. I believe it's something the community wants. I know it's something the Department of Justice wants as part of our settlement agreement, and it's something I want.
Thank you, Mayor and Chief, on that account. All right, Wright Gazaway from K2. Wright, who's your question for?
Yeah, my question's for each. This is certainly welcome news for the people most impacted by these kinds of stops. Do you expect pushback, though, from line officers? And if that happens, how will you confront that, Chief?
No, I don't expect pushback from line officers. I think the way this is being implemented, officers will still have the ability to do a lower level stop if they need to. It's not a directive change or doesn't take away the ability. We're just re-emphasizing our focus onto the moving violations that are more safety related. I think this is a time where officers, I think most of them know we're in a time of change. Reform is upon us, and we're really looking at ways that we can meld what the community is asking for with public safety at the same time.
Mayor, any comment about how you sell this change to law enforcement?
This is a challenging time. As the chief just indicated, this is a transformational period. There are sort of two schools of thought in the community, and I'll get to your question, but I think this is relevant. There are some in the community who see the pace of change as being too slow, that things aren't happening quickly enough, that we're not creating the kinds of reform or accountability that people want to see right now. And then on the other side of the equation, you have people who are saying that this is the wrong kind of change, or it's happening too quickly, or that we're potentially jeopardizing the public's safety. The challenge of change management is taking into account both of these factors. I believe we can still have an adequately resourced and properly trained police bureau with the tools and the training they need on one hand, and we can have increased accountability and transparency on the other. There will naturally be resistance to change, both in the community and internally in the police bureau. And the way I would sell it to the men and women of the police bureau is to, number one, acknowledge that they are trying to do the right thing during a time when they're under withering scrutiny at a time of transformational change. And instead of having them see that as happening to them, continue to work with them and get the kinds of ideas and feedback and input that we've received to help shape these policies from our frontline officers directly. Second of all, we need to acknowledge the reality that we have a scaled down bureau. And therefore, we need to focus on our top public safety priorities. When it comes to traffic stops, addressing those who are truly jeopardizing the public safety through substance abuse, through speeding, through other unsafe practices, that's where we must focus our attention now. And that is my pitch to the men and women of the Portland Police Bureau. We don't have the resources at this point to squander on anything other than the important mission of protecting the public's safety.
Okay, thank you. Next in line, Alex Zielinski from the Portland Mercury. Who's your question for?
Hi, my question is for either the mayor or the chief, depending on just who has the answer. I'm curious, so HB 2002 had a provision that would still send a citation to a driver who violated a low-level traffic violation, but not stop or arrest them. Would that be the same under this new directive? How would kind of traffic violations that didn't threaten public safety be handled?
I'll answer that. That provision in the bill, this change that we're making is really my direction to my officers. It's not necessarily a directive change or anything like that. I think that provision would be something that if it were to come to pass and be implemented by the legislature, we'd have to look at the process for doing that. But what we're looking at doing is shifting our traffic stops towards the more public safety things that are more likely to cause serious crashes or fatalities. So I think that's kind of a apples and oranges comparison a little bit.
The answer is no. As part of this policy, the answer is no.
Could you, just one more thing, could you give a couple examples of what may not result in being stopped anymore under this new directive? I mean, I'm guessing maybe like a light that's out on a
Broken
brake light. Yeah.
during daytime, that's not a safety issue. An expired tag, anything that's not immediately related to the safety of the public, that can be resolved elsewhere through other means. Now, if somebody is driving around without headlights at night, that becomes a safety issue. So context is important too, but those kinds of issues.
And
Okay,
I want to
next.
make it clear too, it's not a directive change. So it's not a change to our directives.
Okay, Maggie Vespa, KGW, who's your question for?
Sure. Hi. Can you hear me? Great. Thank you. My question's for Mayor Wheeler. I predict that we're going to get a lot of people on social media and in our email inbox. They may see the merit in what you said kind of off the top about the social justice angle of this and the political motivations and listening to, the conversations that are being had. But their reaction is going to be, come on, this is just further proof that the cuts the city made last year were too much and that Portland's police bureau can't keep up with gun violence. They can't keep up with assaults. They can't keep up with burglaries. And now it's low-level traffic infractions. So for people who look at this and they say, this wouldn't be happening if we were fully staffed, and this is just another symptom of that, and they're scared by that or they're frustrated, what would you say to those people who that's what they're seeing here?
What I tell them is the truth, which is we have a scaled down police bureau. I have long said that our staffing on the streets is inadequate. And that's one of the reasons I would not support further reductions in the Portland Police Bureau budget. That's why I continue to advocate for adequate staffing of our Portland Police Bureau. But with reduced staffing, that means we need to focus on protecting the public's safety. So this is a better allocation of resources. Let's get the guys who are speeding. Let's get the guys who are operating a motor vehicle under the influence. Let's get the folks, concentrate our efforts on those who are truly putting the public at risk.
Kind of just as a quick follow-up to that, because we do have a big special on gun violence airing tonight, sort of with these changes that are needed and with the stats where they are, were the cuts last summer the right move?
It's hard to go back into the Wayback Machine on this. It's clear we need a more focused intervention around gun violence in our community. This is a national trend. It's been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic, and it's serious. And we can't escape the reality that we need to focus personnel, resources, tools, and training on gun violence. And we've done that. We've significantly increased our investigative capacity through the creation of the Enhanced Community Safety Team. We are working diligently to put a team in the field that would be Portland police officers who are working on interventive strategies to prevent and impact gun violence in the community before it happens, as well as following up on the intervention side. And the City Council just voted a record amount of funding to community-based partners who can address some of the upstream issues related to those who are impacted by gun violence. So really, collectively, this is the first time we've had a spectrum of responses that's been as thoughtful as it is now. I would love for us to be able to have additional capacity that we could deploy to the streets right now, but we don't. So in the absence of that, we need to be smart with the resources we have. I think the Enhanced Community Safety Team, alongside the Focused Intervention Team, alongside the community partners that the City Council has chosen to support, I think that's an effective model.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
That's what we're hearing from those who help, like the California Partnership and others who work with cities to develop effective strategies to reduce gun violence. They're telling us those are the key parts. Those are the parts that we're putting into the field.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Maggie. We've got time for just two more because we started about 5 minutes late, so we'll go to 12:35. Let's start Liz Birch, and then we'll get to you, Jonathan. But Liz Birch from Coin.
Hi, my question is for Mayor Wheeler. Thank you so much for your time. You'd mentioned that you'd heard the concerns from the RR team when they resigned. I'm wondering what your response to those concerns are, and if you're worried about further retention within the Bureau after hearing their concerns.
I am worried about retention in the Bureau. Look, these are men and women who do a very tough job under what I think are probably the most difficult circumstances police officers have ever been asked to operate in. They've been out there night after night after night for 14 months. And what I'm hearing from them is they're tired, they're exhausted, they're stressed, and they don't feel that they have the level of support either from elected officials or from the community to be able to do their jobs effectively. And this last issue of resignations or of indictments weighed heavily on them. And I have to be mindful of the wellness of our city employees, particularly when they tell me that they're exhausted, that they're done. I have to respect that, but and work with them to address those specific issues that they have raised, and they deserve to be heard. On the other hand, the public deserves to know that their safety is being protected. That's why I've directed the chief to deploy the mobile field force. It's not the same thing, but it's similar. We still have a lot of people in the Bureau who are adequately trained. I have personally worked the phones to make sure that we have adequate relationships with the county sheriff as well as the state police and other resources to make sure that our public is protected.
Thank you, Mayor. And last one, Jonathan Levinson, OPB. Jonathan.
Thank you, Mayor and Chief Lovell. I have a question about the new policy, but I also wanted to follow up on what you were just saying about RRT. I'm wondering, I know the indictments weren't the sole cause of the resignation, but the timing was pretty clear and it was part of it. Can we expect similar protests from officers in the face of more oversight or when the new oversight board is stood up?
That's a hypothetical question, and I can't answer it except to say that there will be resistance from some to increased community input and enhanced community measures, but that's where we're heading. I'm going to fight for both the ability for them to have adequate staffing, tools, training, the resources they need to do their jobs effectively. But things are going to be different in the future with regard to policing here in Portland and all across the nation, because what the public is saying loudly and clearly across the political spectrum is they want to be able to trust their police bureaus, not just here, but all across the country. And when you dive a little deeper in terms of what does trust mean, that means more transparency, that means more accountability. And so this is it's a transitional time. There's going to be bumps along the road, but that's the future. I am leading both towards an era where we have adequate staffing, tools, and resources, but we also have increased community trust through improved common sense accountability and transparency measures. Those two things are not mutually exclusive, and that's where I am leading.
Thank you. And then on the new policy, because this isn't a new directive or coming through legislation, it still relies on officer judgment. And Mayor or Chief Lovell, I mean, isn't officer judgment part of the equation that has resulted in disproportionate stops to begin with? What makes you think that that this will change anything?
I don't want to overpromise the results on the disparities piece, because I'm not sure what those will be. And some of the areas where they've tried this, they have a very different demographic than Portland does. But I think what's important here is that we're willing to try this. We're willing to ask officers to do it and look at the data and see if it's having an impact on safety, if it's having an impact on disparities, and then making appropriate judgments from there. I think we're an organization who's made a lot of changes over the last 10 years with our DOJ involvement. And we still, to this day are looking for ways where we can make changes that are both in keeping with what we're hearing the community wants and what's also in the best interest of public safety in the city.
Okay, I think that'll wrap it up for us.